This is a demonstration on how to do an encapsulant adhesion test. The sample is a PV cell laminated to a large sheet of glass. I have a titanium beam with the loading tab already attached, some clean towels, IPA, and a bit of 240 grit metallography paper. Now the metallization on the back of the cell isn't adhered that well, and that's not what we're interested in testing. So the first step is always to grind off the back metallization until you get back to the cell. The way I like to do that is with the metallography paper and a little IPA. I like to do it just in the shape of the width tapered beam, knowing that I'll put the tip of the beam overhanging the cell a bit. And there's really no need to remove more metallization than you need to, and you just need to go down a bit until you see the bare silicon. If you make a large sample like this, where you have encapsulant over the edge of your cell, you know you'll be starting the test with your beam overhanging the edge. You want to take a razor and cut through the encapsulant right where the tip of the beam will be. That way, when you start the test, there's already a break in the encapsulant for the delamination to occur. So this is another slide that I've already gone ahead and ground down all of the metallization above where I'll be applying the beam. This is a multicrystalline cell, so it's easy to tell when you get through the metallization, you see the modeling of the silicon. The next steps are real similar to preparing the backsheet. I have my titanium beam, a bit of IPA for the cleaning. I like to use now 3M DP420 as the epoxy. It works really well between the silicon and the titanium. And I also use a little parafilm and a weight to load the beam while the epoxy cures. So again, just a little IPA to clean the silicon and the beam. And again, I like to both dispense and mix the epoxy right on the back of the beam. I like to use a generous amount now because you don't have the luxury of seeing through the acrylic beam to make sure you have good coverage. So I like to use maybe a little bit more and let it press out. And this epoxy is less viscous and it flows well. So it sets up quite nice. And for a sample like this, I like to overhang the end of the beam past the sample so I won't put any epoxy there. Bit of parafilm so my weight doesn't stick. And you can either let this set up in an oven or just in your lab. After a few minutes, again, come back once the epoxy has hardened a little bit to remove any that has squeezed out the edges. So this epoxy has had about 10 or 15 minutes to set up. And I want to make sure I catch it before it gets too hard to remove any that has squeezed out. See, it's still pretty thin, but it's set up enough where the beam won't be disturbed. And it's really easy just to use the edge of a razor blade to clean up the edges. As opposed, if you let it harden too much, this will really be a bear. Then I can put the weight back on and let it sit overnight and cure. So now the epoxy is fully cured. Before it did so, I came back and I removed what had squeezed out around the beam. And the next step is to section the silicon around the beam. To first do that, I like to use a diamond or carbide tip scribe. It's just a matter of using the beam as a guide to scribe along the silicon. And it's kind of a process of grinding. If you see the silicon chipping or breaking, that's fine. So now I've sectioned all the way through the silicon with my scribe, and I can tell that there's a little channel there because I can feel it. It's a little gooey under the tip of my scribe. The next thing is to take a sharp razor to cut through the encapsulant. And you can be a little vigorous with this. I can feel that I'm touching the glass with the tip of my blade, and that's what I want to do. And actually, if you're able to even remove some of the encapsulant that's around the beam, that's really beneficial in testing. So see, I got a little bit of it here. You just work until you can pull that all up. This is just removing the encapsulant that was exposed by that channel you created by using the scribe. And this will give a nice clean barrier for when you pull up the beam during the adhesion test. I also wanted to show that at least at the coupon level, that these tests can be easily made in a larger load frame, maybe similar to something that you have in your laboratory. So here I have my larger load frame set up to do a coupon level measurement. I have a platen affixed to the bottom, and that same articulating link I used in the small load frame here ultimately fixtured to the load cell. The important thing when using one of these big instruments is to make sure you have an appropriately sized load cell, because remember, the loads we've been measuring frequently aren't more than 200 newtons, and you don't want to be using a way oversized load cell. So now it's real similar to when using the small load frame, but in this instance we'll move our sample instead of moving the load frame. And all I wanted to do is position it into place so that the link fits over my loading tab. And then I can use a couple clamps to hold down my sample. Do some final adjustments to make sure there's no torques or load on the link and that it's situated right over the loading tab, and then you'll be ready to test.